The clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversation filled my son's dining room, masking the tension that had been building all evening. It was precisely late evening on December 25th, and we were in the middle of enjoying the dessert that Clara had spent hours preparing. My wife sat right beside me, her fingers tightly laced together in her lap. Suddenly, our daughter-in-law, Vanessa, stood up at the head of the table. She raised her wine glass, tapping it sharply with the dessert spoon to capture everyone's attention. Her expression was bright, almost theatrical, as her voice cut through the room, stating that we were incredibly fortunate to receive such exceptional service for our holiday meal. She paused, tilting her glass directly toward my wife, and loudly suggested that everyone give a round of applause for the hired help. An uncomfortable silence briefly hung in the air, before a few sharp laughs echoed across the festive table. Vanessa began clapping with an amused, smug look on her face. My son Tyler didn't hesitate. He let out a genuine laugh and joined right in with his wife. Across from them, his sister Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat but remained completely quiet. The only real resistance came from Clara's brother, Lucas, who dropped his fork onto his porcelain plate with a heavy metallic thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. I reached beneath the table and took hold of my wife's hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling violently. Looking up at the head of the table, I spoke her name softly but firmly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fury rising inside me. Vanessa merely rolled her eyes, her posture completely relaxed as she sat back down and took a casual sip of her wine. She dismissed my tone instantly, telling me not to be so incredibly sensitive and claiming it was nothing more than a harmless compliment. She rationalized it by saying my wife had been running back and forth from the kitchen like a servant all evening, so she was simply recognizing the effort. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past year, Vanessa had consistently dropped underhanded insults disguised as polite conversation. A few months back, she handed Clara a laminated list of precise dietary rules for a Sunday lunch, smiling while remarking that she wanted to make things simple since cooking wasn't Clara's strongest area. Another time, she asked Clara to watch her pet for a weekend and sent a barrage of text messages, including one that read, "Please keep him off the couch, because I know expectations are different in your household." Every single time it happened, I convinced myself to let it go. I told myself that she was just young, trying to find her footing in our family, and would eventually outgrow this behavior. But watching her publicly label my wife as the maid in front of our entire family on a holiday wasn't a mistake born out of insecurity. It was deliberate cruelty meant to demean, performed for an audience. I quietly placed my cloth napkin on the table and stood up from my chair. I looked down at my wife and told her to grab her jacket because we were leaving immediately. Tyler's voice hardened, telling me not to create a scene and claiming I was completely overreacting. I didn't engage with him. I simply repeated my instruction to Clara, who stood up without uttering a word. As we walked toward the front door, Vanessa's voice followed us, loud and filled with disbelief, asking if we were actually walking out over a simple joke. We drove home through the dark, empty streets in absolute silence. The festive lights in the neighborhood windows blinked in rhythmic patterns, but the interior of our car was cold and heavy. I kept the radio off, and the only sound filling the space was my wife's uneven breathing as she desperately tried to hold back her tears. The moment we pulled into our driveway, she finally broke the quiet, whispering that Vanessa utterly despised her. I tried to reassure her, telling her that it wasn't hatred, but rather a deep-seated malice, though we both knew it amounted to the exact same thing. Once inside, Clara went straight to the bedroom to isolate herself. I sat alone in the dark living room for hours, replaying the entire dinner over and over in my mind. The smug satisfaction on Vanessa's face, my son's careless laughter, and the painful silence of everyone else. Eventually, I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contacts until I hit a name I hadn't reached out to in a while: Evelyn Vance. She was currently directing a major regional youth advocacy program, a position I had helped her secure nearly a decade ago when she was desperately looking for a career transition. We had kept in touch over the years through occasional messages and annual holiday cards. I pulled up a fresh text message and began to write. It was the season when I typically reached out to old colleagues, former board members, and executives I had placed in significant roles throughout my 30-year career in executive recruiting. I kept the note to Evelyn brief and cordial, wishing her a wonderful holiday and expressing my desire to catch up in the coming weeks. I hit send, and then methodically went through the rest of my professional list, sending out over 40 similar personalized messages to preserve the vast network I had spent a lifetime building. The following morning, the atmosphere in our house was incredibly subdued. Clara quietly brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the winter scenery outside the window. I took a seat across from her and remained quiet, waiting for her to speak first. She looked up and immediately apologized for causing a disruption and forcing us to leave the gathering early. I shook my head, telling her she hadn't done anything wrong and that the entire blame rested solely on Vanessa. Clara sighed, expressing worry that Tyler would be furious with me, that Chloe probably viewed her as overly dramatic, and that Vanessa would likely use this to fuel her resentment forever. I looked her in the eyes and firmly stated that I wouldn't be letting it go either. She begged me not to interfere, claiming it wasn't worth the conflict, but my mind was already racing with a specific strategy. Vanessa was currently employed at the Pacific Northwest Youth Development Foundation. She had been with the organization for 4 years and had recently been promoted to the role of fundraising director. I remembered the detail vividly because Tyler had called me months ago to boast about it, completely thrilled by her corporate advancement. What neither my son nor his wife realized was that my ties to that specific foundation ran incredibly deep. I was the person who had placed their current chief executive nearly 9 years ago. I had personally recommended 2 of their active board members, and I had served as an advisor for their executive transitions on multiple occasions. I didn't hold an official title there, but whenever their leadership needed a high-level background assessment or a strategic network connection, I was always the first person they called. I spent the remainder of the morning reviewing my archived correspondence. I quickly located an email chain from a couple of years back when the organization was restructuring its leadership. The chairperson at the time, a woman named Beatrice Vance, had reached out to ask if I had any strong recommendations for their development team. I had provided her with a short list of 4 qualified professionals, and Vanessa's name had certainly not been among them. She had managed to secure the position entirely on her own merit, or so I had initially assumed. Right around midday, my phone began to ring. It was Evelyn. She greeted me warmly, mentioning she had intended to call after the holidays anyway, but seeing my message the previous evening prompted her to dial right away. When she asked if I had a brief moment to talk, I told her I was completely free. Evelyn dropped her voice slightly, mentioning she had picked up some interesting information through her professional circles regarding my daughter-in-law. My chest tightened instantly as I confirmed the relation. She explained that Vanessa was currently under serious consideration for an influential seat on the National Council for Youth Advocacy. It was a massive advancement opportunity that would grant her widespread national exposure and serve as a monumental stepping stone for her career. Evelyn hesitated for a brief second, choosing her words with extreme care, before explaining that she was serving on the selection committee and wanted to provide me with a quiet warning because there was some difficult history involved. Apparently, Vanessa had collaborated with a woman named Madeline Reyes on a major collaborative fundraising initiative a few years back, and the partnership had ended disastrously. I knew Madeline well. She had successfully managed a prominent mid-sized charitable organization in Seattle for 15 years before stepping down. She was known throughout the industry as a sharp, highly principled, and completely straightforward leader. If someone like Madeline had a serious issue with a colleague, it was almost always backed by a very legitimate reason. When I inquired about what had taken place, Evelyn confessed she didn't know every single detail. All she knew was that when the fundraising campaign failed to hit its financial targets, Vanessa had completely shifted the blame onto Madeline during a critical board meeting, publicly humiliating her in front of their primary financial contributors. Madeline had chosen to resign just a month after the incident. I closed my eyes as the pieces fell into place. It sounded exactly like her. Evelyn concluded by mentioning that the board appointment was far from finalized, and if a credible professional stepped forward with legitimate behavioral concerns during the background review, the entire decision could easily shift. After we finished our conversation, I sat motionless at my desk for a considerable amount of time, staring intently at the blank screen of my phone. I began searching for Madeline Reyes's current contact information, which took me roughly 20 minutes of digging through old network rosters from a regional charity event we had both attended years ago. My fingers hovered over the numbers for a moment before I finally placed the call. She answered on the 3rd ring. I introduced myself, acknowledging that while we hadn't worked together directly, We shared numerous mutual colleagues. After a brief, quiet pause, Madeline responded that she recognized my name immediately through Evelyn and asked how she could assist me. I told her directly that I needed to ask her about her past experience working alongside Vanessa. The silence that followed across the line was heavy and filled with unmistakable weight. Madeline finally spoke, noting that Vanessa was family to me, which wasn't a question but a statement of fact. She asked why I was reaching out under those circumstances. I explained that I needed to truly comprehend her character and that I preferred to hear the account from someone who had witnessed the events firsthand. Madeline remained quiet for a brief moment before sharing the entire situation. She detailed the joint initiative, the subsequent failure to meet the financial objectives, and the exact board meeting where Vanessa had stood up before their largest investors, attributing the entire shortfall to Madeline's traditional methodologies. The most deceptive part was that Vanessa had actively supported those exact strategies during the initial planning phases, yet she arrived at the meeting with fully prepared documentation to shield herself. Madeline chose to step down 30 days later, rather than engage in a messy dispute that would make the entire charity appear unstable. Madeline clarified that Vanessa wasn't bad at her job, which actually made the behavior much worse. She described her as highly competent, capable of managing senior leadership effectively, presenting herself well, and securing major donations. However, she added that Vanessa was completely willing to step over people to protect her own position, and she always did it with a pleasant expression. I told Madeline that I completely believed her account, and when she asked what had prompted my inquiry, I described the events of our holiday dinner. I told her about the dessert Clara had worked on all afternoon, and how the phrase about the hired help had been delivered like a punchline to amuse the room. Madeline's tone softened significantly, expressing her deep regret that my wife had been subjected to such treatment. I thanked her for her transparency, and she noted that I intended to take action, expressing relief that someone was finally going to address the behavior. Once the call ended, I remained at my desk for a long time. I began composing a clear, professional email to Beatrice Vance, the former chair of Vanessa's current foundation, keeping the tone light and conversational. I mentioned that I was conducting some routine network checks, came across Madeline Reyes's name, and wondered if she had a few moments to share her perspective on their past collaboration. Beatrice replied a couple of hours later, confirming she knew Madeline well and inviting me to call her office the following afternoon. I purposely kept Clara completely in the dark about these discussions. Later that evening, my son's name flashed on my phone screen. I let the initial call go straight to voicemail, but when he dialed again 10 minutes later, I finally picked up. Tyler immediately demanded to know what was wrong with me, furious that we had walked out on the holiday gathering and claiming I had humiliated everyone in front of the family. I responded calmly, pointing out that his wife had openly insulted his stepmother in front of everyone. Tyler dismissed it entirely as a joke, telling me I was treating the situation as if a major crime had been committed. He claimed Clara was perfectly fine, and that I was the one escalating a minor issue into a massive conflict. I paused for a second before asking him a direct question, instructing him to think carefully before responding. I asked if he truly respected Clara, to which he instantly replied that he did. Then I asked if he honestly believed Vanessa respected her. The extended silence on the other end of the line gave me my answer. Tyler finally deflected, stating that Vanessa simply had her own way of navigating relationships but didn't mean any harm by it. I told him that wasn't a real answer and pointed out that he had actively laughed along with the insult. He fell silent, and I concluded by stating that while I wasn't demanding an apology for my wife, he needed to look closely at the behavior he was actively defending before I hung up the phone. Before I reveal the next step I took, I want you to ask yourself a question. If someone you loved more than anything was publicly degraded at a family gathering on a holiday, what path would you choose? Would you simply overlook the malice to keep the peace, or would you take definitive action to ensure that boundary was never crossed again? The choice I made next altered the dynamics of our family permanently, and there was absolutely no turning back from it. I spoke with Beatrice the following afternoon in a conversation that lasted roughly half an hour. She verified every single detail Madeline had shared, adding that the organization's leadership had privately questioned Vanessa's ethics after Madeline's departure, but they lacked the documented proof of a consistent pattern to take action. Beatrice described her as incredibly driven and talented, but notes that her absolute ruthlessness left people feeling deeply uneasy, concluding she would never place her in an upper management role without strict monitoring. Beatrice confirmed that Vanessa was still hitting strong fundraising metrics at the foundation, but she questioned why I was suddenly investigating her background. I simply replied that she was family, and I needed to understand her true character. Beatrice validated that but warned me to proceed with caution, noting that Vanessa reacted incredibly poorly to any form of criticism. That evening, I put together a meticulous, comprehensive summary for Evelyn. I refrained from using emotional language or offering personal opinions. I simply presented the verifiable facts. I included Madeline's first-hand testimony regarding the budget ambush and Beatrice's confirmation of the internal fallout that followed. Every sentence was carefully structured to ensure absolute accuracy, rather than a desire for vengeance. Once the email was ready, I called Evelyn directly to walk her through the details. She listened attentively without a single interruption, finally stating that the information was incredibly substantial and ensuring the entire review committee would have it before the final vote. I clarified that my goal wasn't to systematically dismantle her professional life, and Evelyn responded that she understood, but noted that leadership teams deserved to know the true nature of the people they were bringing on board. After concluding the call, I remained at my desk staring at the glowing monitor. Clara walked into the room asking what was keeping me occupied, and I casually answered that I was just clearing up some professional correspondence. She looked at me for a long, quiet moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but she chose not to press for details and returned to the kitchen. Soon after, the rhythmic, steady sound of her chopping vegetables echoed down the hallway. 3 days later, while I was sitting at the kitchen counter with my morning coffee, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Chloe. She urgently asked if I had done something, explaining that Vanessa had just received an official notification that she was completely out of the running for the national board seat, and she was absolutely spiraling. I left the text unanswered. Exactly 20 minutes later, Tyler's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring out and he immediately left a furious, unstable voicemail. His voice trembled with intense anger as he stated that he knew exactly who was behind this, explaining that Vanessa had been working toward this specific milestone for over 2 years, and now she was suddenly entirely blacklisted from the opportunity. He shouted into the recorder that people were explicitly referencing serious concerns regarding her workplace conduct, accusing me of leveraging my professional network to completely crush her career. He severed the call before I could have said anything, not that I had any intention of defending my actions. I walked into the living room and played the recording aloud for Clara. Her face drained of color as she sat down heavily, asking me what I had done. I looked at her and said that I had simply allowed the truth to be told. I explained everything to Clara in complete detail: the conversations with Madeline and Beatrice, the history of workplace manipulation, and the formal documentation I had shared with Evelyn. Clara listened in total silence before asking why I had initiated all of this without her knowledge. I told her honestly that because Vanessa had deeply wounded her, I couldn't sit by and let it go unanswered. Clara shook her head, stating firmly that the situation wasn't mine to settle. She explained that she had already made the conscious decision to forgive Vanessa the very morning after the holiday dinner, choosing not to carry that emotional weight anymore. I countered that I was merely trying to shield her, but Clara stood up looking at me with deep disappointment. She told me that she didn't require a protector, and that I should have respected her enough to ask what she actually wanted before altering her life and her relationships. An hour later, our front door rattled as the doorbell was rung 6 times in rapid succession, followed by heavy pounding against the wood. When I opened it, Vanessa was standing on the porch, her face blotchy and her makeup entirely ruined from crying. She instantly accused me of destroying her life, but I remained calm, stating that I had simply provided an honest reference when a colleague inquired. She yelled that I had deliberately sabotaged her career out of petty vindictiveness because she refused to bow down to my wife. Clara appeared in the hallway behind me, but she didn't tell Vanessa to leave. She simply stood there with her arms at her sides, watching the display with a quiet, detached expression that contained neither anger nor sorrow. Clara spoke softly, reminding Vanessa that she had spent all afternoon preparing that holiday dessert for the family because she genuinely wanted them to have a beautiful evening, adding that she hoped Vanessa would someday realize the personal cost of trying to keep this family together. Vanessa seemed caught off guard for a fraction of a second, perhaps experiencing a brief wave of shame, but her expression quickly hardened again. She turned her fury back to me, screaming that the board position was everything to her career and that I had stolen it over a harmless holiday joke. I looked at her and said it wasn't a joke, nor was it a single incident. I pointed out that she had treated Clara as an inferior since the very first day they met, acting with consistent cruelty and disrespect, and that I was completely finished watching it happen. Vanessa called me a controlling old man who couldn't handle the fact that my son had a life outside of my influence. I responded that she was nothing more than a bully who targeted people she assumed wouldn't fight back, adding that the only difference now was that the people who mattered in her professional world finally knew exactly who she was. Her face crumbled in defeat, and after casting one last unreadable look at Clara, she turned around, walked to her vehicle, and sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before starting the engine and speeding away. Later that evening, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the house had grown quiet, Clara sat across from me at the table, wrapping both hands around a warm mug of tea. She revisited the topic, pointing out again that I had made a massive decision regarding her family without consulting her. I repeated that I had to make a choice regarding my own family, because watching my wife be humiliated required a response. Clara was quiet for a long time as the distant sound of traffic faded outside. She finally confessed that she wasn't angry, even though she knew she should be because I had bypassed her consent. She looked up and explained that she just needed me to recognize that the choice should have been hers to make. I acknowledged my mistake, admitting that I had taken that agency away from her and apologizing sincerely. It wasn't full forgiveness, but rather a complex realization that two conflicting truths could exist at once. I was right to stand up for her, but I was entirely wrong to do it without her. An hour later, a text arrived from Tyler stating that we were to never contact him or Vanessa again, effectively cutting us off. I handed the phone to Clara, who read the message and handed it back without saying a single word. The heavy quiet that settled over our home in the following weeks felt entirely different from the peaceful silence we used to enjoy. It was dense, burdened by the realization of what had been broken. However, what I didn't know at the time was that the professional fallout for Vanessa was only beginning, and it was no longer driven by my actions. Early the next February, Evelyn reached out with a surprising update. She informed me that Vanessa's name had been forwarded for a prominent regional leadership role within the Seattle Children's Alliance, which would have been a massive advancement from her current position. The selection committee had systematically reached out to various industry leaders for background checks, and it turned out that Madeline Reyes was actually serving on that specific committee. Madeline hadn't even realized Vanessa had thrown her hat into the ring until her professional file landed directly on her desk. I listened intently, asking what transpired next. Evelyn explained that while Madeline properly recused herself from the final voting process to maintain neutrality, she made absolutely certain the hiring committee received a meticulous, fully documented breakdown of the ethical violations that occurred at their previous organization. When I inquired if Vanessa had been denied the position, Evelyn revealed that she had actually withdrawn her application entirely the previous afternoon. As soon as I disconnected the call, I noticed Clara standing quietly in the doorway of my study. She looked at me and asked if there was more trouble, and I admitted that Vanessa had just lost out on another major employment opportunity. Clara took a seat across from me, asking point blank how many individuals I had actually spoken to initially. I told her the truth, only 3. I named Madeline, Beatrice, and Evelyn. But when Clara followed up by asking how many people those 3 had subsequently spoken to, I remained silent because I truly didn't have an answer. That is the reality of professional reputations within highly specialized, tight-knit circles. Once the verifiable truth begins to circulate, it gains its own momentum and travels completely independent of whoever started it. By the time March arrived, Chloe called to let me know that Vanessa was deeply struggling in her current role at the foundation. Apparently, her executive director had caught wind of the national board seat rejection and began investigating the situation, which led leadership to scrutinize her management style, her treatment of subordinate staff, and her handling of internal disagreements much more closely. Chloe clarified that she hadn't been terminated, but she had been placed on formal notice and was fully aware her position was unstable. Meanwhile, Tyler completely refused to acknowledge my existence. He wouldn't engage with Chloe much either, creating a deep rift between the siblings. Lucas mentioned to me that he had accidentally crossed paths with Tyler at a local market, and the moment my son spotted him, He turned on his heel and walked rapidly in the opposite direction. Lucas remarked that the boy desperately needed to stand on his own 2 feet, but I countered that he was merely attempting to defend his wife. Lucas shook his head, pointing out that there was a massive distinction between supporting a partner and enabling a bully. By the time April rolled around, Chloe phoned with another significant update, revealing that the two of them had officially entered marriage counseling. She explained that Vanessa bitterly blamed Tyler for failing to protect her against my actions, while Tyler resented Vanessa for igniting the entire feud with her holiday behavior in the first place. When Chloe admitted she didn't know who was truly at fault, I told her they both were, feeling no sense of triumph, only an overwhelming weight of exhaustion. Clara, however, seemed to transform as the weeks went by, appearing distinctly lighter. She no longer had to mentally brace herself for our regular family dinners, nor did she have to handle condescending text messages regarding complex menu demands or pet-sitting obligations. Free from that pressure, she began dedicating several days a week to volunteering at the Community Literacy Center, choosing to spend her hours surrounded by individuals who genuinely respected her rather than those who merely tolerated her presence. Her laughter returned, sounding much more effortless, and she completely stopped offering apologies for situations that were never her fault to begin with. On a pleasant evening in May, while we were sitting together on the back veranda, she turned to me and openly inquired if I harbored any regrets regarding what had occurred with Vanessa. I took a moment to evaluate my feelings honestly before responding. I told her that while I deeply regretted that the situation had reached such an extreme point, I would never regret taking action to shield her from malice. Clara nodded slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the garden. She reiterated that she had truly forgiven Vanessa, but pointed out that granting forgiveness does not mean the natural consequences of a person's behavior simply vanish into thin air. She admitted she had been reflecting on the entire ordeal extensively, concluding that I had ultimately made the correct decision, though she explicitly wished I had chosen to handle the issue alongside her, rather than executing it entirely on her behalf. I took her hand, telling her that I understood the distinction completely and was actively working on being a better partner. She gave my hand a gentle squeeze, letting the quiet settle between us without needing another word. The situation took an entirely unexpected turn when June arrived. I received a concise, direct email from Madeline Reyes. The message simply expressed her gratitude for my willingness to hold Vanessa accountable, noting that Vanessa had caused significant professional harm to numerous individuals over the years without ever facing any real boundaries. I didn't send an immediate reply, but I found myself opening and rereading that email multiple times over the following days, before finally sending a brief note of appreciation for her trust. Then, toward the end of the month, Chloe reached out with a tense warning. She revealed that Vanessa had discovered my direct involvement in the reference checks and was refusing to let the matter drop. According to Chloe, Vanessa was aggressively contacting industry professionals to trace exactly who I had spoken with, desperate to find grounds to allege that I had fabricated the reports and had already consulted a legal representative regarding a potential defamation claim. My stomach dropped at the prospect of an impending legal battle. I immediately placed a call to Beatrice Vance to see if she had been contacted. Beatrice answered right away, confirming that Vanessa had reached out the previous day demanding to know the exact details of our discussion. When I asked how she had handled the inquiry, Beatrice assured me she had told the absolute truth, confirming that I had asked routine background questions and that she had provided an accurate, documented assessment of Vanessa's professional conduct. She added that Vanessa had angrily threatened to file an official grievance with the state licensing board for tortious interference, but Beatrice told me not to worry because everything discussed was entirely factual and verifiable. True to her word, a certified demand letter from a legal firm arrived at my residence 2 days later, accusing me of malicious interference and demanding a full retraction under the threat of an immediate lawsuit. I handed the legal document to Clara, and her fingers trembled slightly as she scanned the formal threats on the page. She looked up, her voice laced with anxiety, and asked if Vanessa actually had the power to take everything we owned. I tried to calm her fears, explaining that while anyone can pay a fee to file a lawsuit, the law requires proof, and the absolute truth is an ironclad shield against claims of defamation. Despite my outward confidence, the reality of the situation kept me awake for the next several nights. I lay frozen in bed, staring blankly at the dark ceiling while meticulously retracing every single sentence I had spoken to Madeline, Beatrice, and Evelyn. Every detail I shared was entirely accurate and backed by records, but a legal battle takes a massive toll on a person's finances, time, and emotional well-being, which was exactly what Vanessa was counting on. The following morning, I secured the services of an experienced attorney named Robert Miller, a seasoned specialist in handling complex employment and corporate reputation disputes. I forwarded him the certified demand letter along with every piece of supporting evidence I possessed: the archived email threads, my personal notes, Madeline's detailed account, and Beatrice's confirmation of the internal restructuring. He reviewed the materials and called me back within a few hours, completely dismissing the threat. Miller assured me that the letter was nothing more than a standard scare tactic designed to cause panic, noting that responding to legitimate, confidential industry references does not constitute illegal interference. He advised me to completely ignore the deadline, stating that we would respond aggressively if she actually filed a lawsuit, though he doubted she would ever take it to court. I desperately wanted to believe his assessment, but knowing Vanessa's stubborn pride, I knew she wouldn't concede easily. The 14-day ultimatum expired without a single word from her legal counsel. Toward the end of July, Chloe called with another major update, revealing that Vanessa had officially dropped the entire matter. Apparently, her own legal team had thoroughly reviewed the evidence and informed her that she didn't have a single leg to stand on in a court of law. I let out a massive breath, feeling the suffocating weight finally lift from my chest. Chloe added that Tyler was completely beside himself with anger because Vanessa had drained $5,000 from their shared savings account just to pay for useless legal consultations that achieved absolutely nothing. When I asked how my son was handling the strain, Chloe admitted that their home had become a constant war zone, with Tyler resenting the financial ruin and Vanessa fiercely blaming my interference for her career stagnation. She admitted their relationship appeared to be completely fracturing, leaving me with a heavy mixture of quiet guilt and lingering resolve. When Chloe asked if I actually felt bad about the fallout, the question hung heavily in the air. I thought back to the agonizing sight of Clara's hands shaking at that holiday table, the years of subtle cruelty we had endured under our own roof, and the calculated way Vanessa had ruined Madeline's career just to protect her own image. I told Chloe that while it broke my heart to know my son was trapped in such misery, I would never feel guilty for allowing the truth to surface. By the time August arrived, Evelyn reached out one last time to inform me that Vanessa was actively interviewing for corporate fundraising roles completely outside the nonprofit sector, attempting to find a clean slate now that her reputation had caught up with her. I thanked her for the update and looked out the window into the garden, watching Clara peacefully tend to her plants, completely unburdened by the shadow that had hung over our family for years. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, Clara looked across the table and asked if I believed the storm had finally passed. I set my fork down slowly, admitting that while Vanessa seemed to have run out of ways to fight me, the situation with Tyler remained entirely uncertain. I asked her if the distance from our son caused her pain every day, and she reached across the table, gently squeezing my hand in silent validation. My suspicions about the lingering resentment were confirmed in September, when a brief, unexpected message appeared in my digital inbox. It was from Vanessa. The subject line was completely empty, and the body of the text contained only a few sharp sentences, stating that she would likely never extend forgiveness to me and still viewed my actions as a massive overreaction. Yet she finally comprehended the exact reason why I had chosen to intervene. There was no formal closing or signature, and I chose to leave the message completely unanswered. 2 weeks later, Chloe phoned with the news that Vanessa had successfully secured a corporate relations position with a firm located in a major city a few hours away. It offered an excellent compensation package and, more importantly, a completely fresh start where nobody knew her history. She added that Tyler and Vanessa were officially preparing to relocate, and their current home would be hitting the real estate market within the month. A sharp pang of sorrow hit my chest as I realized my son had chosen to hide this massive life transition from me entirely. When Clara found me sitting motionless in the living room an hour later, I looked up and broke the news that Tyler was leaving the area. She sat down tightly beside me, her voice soft as she admitted she had already heard the news through family circles. We sat together in the fading golden light of the late afternoon, watching the sun dip below the horizon in complete silence. I turned to my wife and asked if she believed our son would ever find it in his heart to forgive my interference. Clara looked at me tenderly, stating that while the future remained entirely uncertain, She believed that time and maturity might eventually allow him to understand my perspective, but she added a sobering truth, reminding me that if he chose to maintain the estrangement, it was a heavy consequence I would simply have to endure, just as she had endured years of public belittling, and just as Madeline had lived with the professional betrayal. She emphasized that every difficult choice carries a lifelong weight, and the real question was whether the peace and protection I bought for her was worth the heavy burden I now had to carry. She looked at me intently, stating that for her, the answer was an absolute yes, but it was a resolution I had to find within my own conscience. The moving trucks arrived at Tyler's house in October, and he departed for his new life without ever calling to say a final goodbye. I forced myself to drive past the property a single time after they left, staring at the bright management sign staked into the front lawn and the completely bare windows that made the structure look entirely hollow. To find some space to breathe, Clara and I took a quiet trip to the northern coast the following month, renting a secluded cabin right near the water where we spent our afternoons walking along the damp shoreline. One chilly afternoon, as the low tide exposed the vast stretches of gray sand, Clara stopped walking and gazed out at the distant horizon, gently revisiting the topic of our son's silence. I looked at her, admitting openly that the loss of that relationship caused a sharp ache in my heart every single day. Clara turned to face me, holding her hair back against the sharp coastal wind as she revealed she had been reconsidering her earlier words. She explained that she no longer believed I had acted entirely on her behalf, suggesting that I had also taken that stand for my own sake, because my core identity demanded that systematic cruelty be answered. She let go of her hair, letting it blow freely in the sea breeze as she noted that my unyielding protective nature was exactly who I was, a trait she had fully recognized and accepted the day she chose to marry me. We stood in the damp air for a long time, watching the rhythmic waves pull back into the ocean without needing to fill the space with words. When we finally returned home a few days later, we discovered a small cardboard parcel waiting on our front porch addressed directly to Clara. Inside was a beautiful handwritten card containing a single elegant sentence thanking her for sharing her holiday dessert method and noting it had been the absolute highlight of the winter gathering. Clara held the paper for a long time, and I immediately thought back to how Chloe had shifted uncomfortably at the table that night, and how she had quietly reached out days later to casually ask if Clara would ever be open to sharing the recipe. My wife had sent the details over without ever mentioning the interaction to me. Clara walked into the kitchen and carefully pinned the card to the surface of the refrigerator, right next to a faded photograph from our wedding day. The house feels noticeably quieter these days, and our son's absence remains a permanent, familiar ache. But Clara no longer hesitates when someone knocks on our front door. Her laughter is no longer guarded, and she navigates her life with an effortless confidence she hasn't felt in years. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next dramatic tale. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.